You know, I've gone on this journey over the last couple of years of getting rid of things. And I'm down to the very last thing to get rid of, which is books. It's so hard for me to get rid of books. They mean so much to me. They shape so much of how I think. And it's just really hard for me to let go of them. One time I heard that if you happen to have books in your house on a bookshelf, then some night when you have nothing to do or you're looking for something interesting, you might pick up one of the books and read it. And because of that, I've always kept books around me. You know, it's been a process. I've spent 2 years downsizing. Of course, it's hard to get rid of everything, but especially the things that mean something to you. You know, clothes were not that hard to get rid of. My mom's things, my mom passed away a few years ago, and her things really hard to let go of. So I tried to just keep things that represented her to me, you know, like particular pieces of clothing that really epitomized who she was. And so I have a drawer full of my mom's clothes, but otherwise I've gotten rid of almost everything. And I want to, you know, live in this RV and be retired in my RV. So I left a bunch of things in my car that I couldn't let go of, that I just didn't know what to do with. They were the last things out of the house, the last things to let go of. And now when I look in my car, I pretty much see books. That's it. Like yearbooks. You know, what do you do with your yearbooks? You don't want to get rid of yearbooks. And so I'm going to see if I can find somewhere in the RV to store them. And if there's any that I can get rid of, that I maybe should get rid of. Because they're just books. You can find them online if you're really looking for a particular book. But, you know, I come from the time when you picked up a book and you spent time with your book. And I remember going on different trips and different parts of my life and what I was reading during those trips and during different things that happened in my life, because the background of everything I was thinking about were these books and these stories that I was reading. I really like the Russian authors. I really like, you know, guys from the 1800s, Russian authors. Those are my favorite. And so I've read most of them. And when I read something, I don't just read it once. I usually read it, you know, up to 5 times if I like it. I just kind of keep going back over and over again, just to kind of absorb the ideas in the book. Also in those Russian books, I just thought it was so interesting to see how they thought about things and how they lived in the 17 and 1800s. And much like Jane Austen, people are curious about the, you know, 1800s in England. And so we read Jane Austen and we love those settings, you know. And so I'm that way about Russian books as well. All that to say, when I like a book, I read it many times. And so a lot of these books I have a lot of history with. And yeah, so I'm going to see what I can do. I need to clean my car out. It's mostly full of books. There's some lumber and moldings and stuff. But that's what I'm going to work on this afternoon. This is an example of something really special to me. My grandfather gave me his little library. It's literally called the Little Library, I think. It's the Little Leather Library, published by Robert K. Haas, New York. And I believe these are from the early 1900s. So what you would do is you would send away in the mail and get classics in these little form, so you could carry it around with you, a lot like we carry our phones around with us. They would carry these little books around and read them. This is A Christmas Carol. Obviously it's a condensed version, but you would have Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol in your pocket and you could read it whenever you want. I have a bunch of these. My grandfather left them to me. These are all the Little Leather Library. Everything from Shakespeare to Robert Burns, Longfellow, Tennyson, a lot of classics. Sonnets from the Portuguese, Elizabeth Browning, and Best Poems of America. So yeah, it's a Little Leather Library, and I think it's from the early 1900s. I have Tolstoy and just collected works of Russian authors, Crime and Punishment, And then more recently, I really like Solzhenitsyn. I've read all of his books. They are, you know, I was born in the 60s, and he got an award for, I think it was a Pulitzer, for A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which I read when I was a teenager, and I just continued to read it throughout life. I don't know why, I just think they're very raw and kind of very interesting, describing the human condition. So, yeah, I love his books as well. And he's the most current author I've read, probably. I can remember traveling in my 30s when I was married, and I always had this book with me, and I would just read it anytime I was alone or just wanted to kind of, I don't know, recenter myself. I love this book, and you can see it's had a lot of good wear and tear. Great book. I'm a Christian, so I've read the Bible a bunch of times, and for many years, you know, every day I read it. Now I listen to it on an app, but for many years they didn't have that, so I just actually read these books. And then through my spiritual journey, I of course read all of C.S. Lewis. This is probably his most interesting work, Till We Have Faces. I keep thinking about this, and it just presents a lot of mysteries. It's very interesting. So all of C.S. Lewis, and then I read a lot of Merton, and kind of, you know, because I was raiding my mom's bookshelf in the 70s, I was reading whatever she was reading. So Imitation of Christ and The Road Less Traveled. And so thank you to my mom for her library that I secretly raided all the time. This is another example of things that are hard to get rid of. Mother Teresa, I love her sayings. I don't know if you've ever read her sayings, but she really has a different take on life, and it's so interesting to read what she thought, you know. And then Watchman Nee, another Christian writer, Chinese guy from the 1800s, but a very interesting read. Thomas Merton, really interesting guy, monk. He had a lot of interesting thoughts. Interior Castle. This is a book from before the 1800s. I don't know if I'm not sure what year. But St. Teresa de Avila, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Friendship. Yeah, you know, anytime I was at a bookstore and they had a clearance rack and they had classics, I would pick up classics. Really any classics, because classics are the best from history, you know. So like when you read a modern book, you don't really know how good it is, but a classic is like tested over time, and it wouldn't still be here if it wasn't good, you know. So it's kind of an easy way to make sure you're always reading very high quality literature. Just pick classics, and anytime I saw a classic, I would pick it up. Didn't always love all of them, but I always learned a lot from them. I'll tell you a classic that I never read. I mean, I tried to read it many times, and I always thought, ugh, I didn't like it. And then all of a sudden in my 50s, I fell in love with it, and that was Moby Dick, which is kind of crazy. It's an American novel, and most people read it, you know, early in life. I tried to read it a few times because it's supposed to be one of the great American novels, but I just really didn't like it. But man, when I started reading it again in my 50s, it clicked, and I read it 5 times. I just loved it. I just wanted to read it over and over again. The language was beautiful. I just loved it. So it's interesting how different times in your life, different things appeal to you. Maybe you understand things differently, you know, at different times in your life. And I remember things that I read in college that mean completely different things to me now than they did then. Along with C.S. Lewis is George MacDonald. George MacDonald is maybe not as great a writer as C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis called him his mentor. And so I read all the George MacDonald books as well. This one is Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood. It's a lesser known work, but it's really about relationships And there's always like Christians in there and relationships with their community, and very interesting. Of course, the best George MacDonald book, I think anybody would agree, is Sir Gibbie. Sir Gibbie's such a lovely book, and one of my favorites for a long time. I read it many times. And then one time, I actually met a lady who had named one of her children Gibbie, Sir Gibbie, because he passed away. I think she had a miscarriage, and so they put Sir Gibbie on his tombstone and named him after that book. If you haven't read Sir Gibbie by George MacDonald, you might want to look at it. It's really amazing. One thing about George MacDonald is he had a bunch of kids. I think he had over 10 kids, and he had to support them. So he had to constantly write, and he wrote all kinds of different kinds of books. He wrote romances, he wrote fairy tales, he wrote fantasy adult literature. Like, he just wrote so many books, so many different kinds of books. And I know some people don't think he's a great writer, but I've read actually all of his genres because I like the spiritual content. This is one of his fairy tales, The Princess and the Goblin. And yeah, that's George MacDonald. And this, I have to laugh at this. I don't know how many of you remember covering your books for school. Like on the first day of school, they would assign to cover your books. And this is covered with a grocery bag. But I did this myself when I was in my 30s, and it's the works of Leo Tolstoy. I felt like this book was kind of old and falling apart, so I covered it. So just so you guys know, in the 60s and 70s, we all had to cover all of our books to preserve them. This is collected works of Tolstoy, copyright 1928. At Baylor, where I went to school, we would go out for 6 weeks and camp if you wanted a geology degree, and we were required to write about each one of our stops. And yeah, so we were out camping for 6 weeks. I'll never forget, it was 16 guys and 8 girls, and we were out in camping for 6 weeks. So everybody got really dirty. It was kind of my intro to camping. So this is the Grand Canyon. And I'll never forget, one of my professors grading this book says, "The reference notes will make a poor sketch useful." He was not impressed with my drawings. If you see, there's all the different layers of wherever that was. You can see the different rocks. I was not a natural scientist, but I got a geology degree because of, potential work. And my parents were happy that I didn't just go for a literature degree. Of course, I would have preferred a literature degree, but I still got to take all the literature classes, but I just ended up with a science degree. I also got a Spanish degree just because I always took them as electives. Another Russian writer from mid-century is Sakharov. Amazing. Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. Just his memories of, or his writings about Russian prisons. Just amazing. They were still ruled by the communists. And this is a bunch of stories about Russian prisons from 1918 to 1956. A lot of political prisoners and just the conditions they experienced. It's really an amazing history of a whole system of imprisoning people by Lenin and Stalin. I think Stalin was worse than Lenin in terms of the numbers of people he imprisoned. Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a German guy in World War II, but he was a Christian. And he was ultimately killed by the Nazis. And he was an amazing person. And his book, Ethics, he has a lot of excellent books, but this was the one called Ethics. It's what are ethics based on? really amazing thinker. Later in my life, I tried to get into English authors just for entertainment. So I read Anthony Trollope's books, and they're kind of like Jane Austen. They're just situational books about England in the probably 1800s. And he also has a book set in Australia during that time, which is really interesting. So this is what happens to me every time I try to get rid of books. I've just succeeded in moving all the books from over there to over here and putting them in different piles. And I can't see any that I want to get rid of. So I still don't know what I'm going to do with them, but it was really fun going through them all. You know, I came out here to clean my car. I didn't really expect to talk all this time about all my books. I do think it's part of the thinking, though, of downsizing. You know, how important things are to a person and what you can scale down to just live more free. I do feel a lot more free since I've gotten rid of most of my possessions. And I do think after doing this video that I'm going to keep my books. I think the ones that I have now, I think I'm going to put in a bookshelf in my RV because they do mean a lot to me. And I don't have that many things, so I don't feel bad about keeping a few books. I'll probably keep the ones that I talked about today because, yeah, they mean a lot to me. But downsizing, you know, I encourage, if you are thinking about downsizing, it does make you feel really free. And I know for me, I wouldn't be able to retire if I didn't downsize and kind of, I guess for me to live a more free life and not be so tied to a career, a job, working all the time. For me, it meant trying to figure a way out. You know, if I continued to pay my mortgage and be surrounded by all of my things, I would have had to keep working forever. I don't think I wouldn't have been able to keep paying my mortgage if I ever stopped working. And that's just not the life I want. I really didn't enjoy living in a permanent house that much. Like, it was nice, you know, to have a house. And I think as you're growing up, like in my 30s, I got my first house and then I had a couple of more. So it is nice when you're in the middle of, you know, career, raising kids, to have a home and fill it with all your things that you love. But for me, I felt very bogged down at the end of my 50s. I really wanted to get free, and I just wanted to get rid of all my junk. And I did, and I do feel more free, and it means I can retire. You know, I'm 63, and instead of continuing to just work and devote myself to my career, I get to make choices about how I want to spend my time. To be honest, I'm still kind of finding myself. I'm not really sure how I'm going to spend my time. I did take a inventory this week, and I decided that there are basic things that I really want to do with my time, and I'm going to kind of create a bit of a schedule so that I do basic things that I'm interested in. So yeah, I did not plan to talk about books on this. I planned to clean out my car, but I do think it's interesting to reflect over what's important to you, and I think it's one of the things that I can keep is my books. So yeah, this has been a trip down memory lane for me, but it's also helped me because I think I am going to have a bookshelf in the RV. I do want to continue to read my books and maybe find some new ones. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.